Hello and welcome. It's Tuesday. It's Vintage Super League time. I'm joined by Eric Froelich. Welcome, Eric.
Always great to be here.
Completely agree. Always great to be here. Wish
Tuesday's
I
the best
was
day of the week. It's Christmas.
Christmas morning. We get to find out what presents everybody brought for us to watch for the next 3 weeks. You
hmm
have any theories you're comfortable sharing as we get ready to see what people brought, or it's tough
I
to
got a,
talk. You play the last match of the day. You're against Luis Scott Vargas, a big match with lots of number one seed implications. So I
yeah.
understand if there's not much you can say, but what can you say?
I mean, I have a lot of speculations. I have a lot of decks that I feel like I already know people have kind of, slipped through the cracks. Try to ask for advice when I'm not playing them. For some people they might be playing against, and it's tough. It's we kind of have a good idea at this point because we're in the sixth essentially trimester of playing against each other, and people
Right.
do have tendencies, and so you have a better idea of, I guess, what people are capable of, what people prefer to play, and based on position they're in now, how other decks have gone for them, you can have a general sense of what they're looking to do at least, and people can throw you off very easily, but um, you can get a pretty good idea, a pretty good sense of people's ranges, I guess.
I certainly built the little chart of okay, here's my opponents, here's what they played, one, two, three playoffs, one, two. Less information on Kai, perhaps, who we've really only seen one deck from. He sort of played a stock Delver list when he was too sick to turn in a week one deck list. So I had a little less information on him, but no, I
Yeah,
hear you. I hear you.
yeah, I think that Kai would definitely be, if I had to pick one person in the league besides myself who I could say, all right, he could show up with literally any deck in Vintage. I feel confident that I would choose Kai as that person. I don't think it's necessarily the biggest deal that we have the smallest staple on him, as I do think that he's just going to play whatever he feels like playing whenever the time comes around. And, you could say the exact same thing about, like, Luis, but what he feels like playing is the same thing every time. So, I
Well,
mean,
yeah, but see, I have Kai in the Luis camp of never, ever, ever going to show up with a Mixer's Workshop list.
really, Kai won Worlds with Covetous Dragon.
Okay. Just seems like he wants to play with big, powerful blue things. You make a fine
I
point.
We all want to play with big, powerful blue things. That doesn't mean we can't show up with workshops. I mean, I had Kai as number one deck workshops for last trimester, and I was wrong. He played those,
Okay.
but I slanted my sideboard very heavily for the mirror to play against other shops decks, thinking that both Kai and Chris, there was huge parts of their range that were shops, and that could have been wrong. I mean, maybe Kai is never going to play shops. Maybe that you're exactly right, but
You have to agree Luis is not going to show up with the workshop deck.
Luis is going to show up with four Force of Wills in his deck, and one Ancestral Recall, and one Time Walk, and two to four Mental Missteps, and probably
Okay.
Dig Time or Treasure Cruise. Like, yeah, that's what I expect from Luis 100% of the time. And if that's wrong, so be it. I mean, not the end of the world, but that is what I expect Luis's range to be. That's what he enjoys. That's what he's good at. He's really good at those mirrors. And those decks are good against a lot of other decks. Having a card like Force of Will gives you a lot of game against a lot of decks. It's just a powerful card and a lot of things to gain a lot of advantage. Ancestral Recall and Treasure Cruise are fantastic spells in whatever shell you put around them. So that's what Luis tends to play. That's what Luis is probably best at playing, and that's what I expect to see him play every single time.
Probably get us once. We play the league enough years. He'll show up one time. Have
Sure. I mean, if
fun.
it's a one game playoff and he's playing against someone who he knows is going to overextend into trying to beat that strategy. Of course, he could play any other deck, but it's very hard to go like, okay, Luis is going to try to mix things up and play a deck that we don't expect, and for A of all to be good and B of all to not conflict to have any hate cards with the other two matchups that you play that week, because it's not like you're going to get paired against a week where you're like, okay, play against Luis, and Luis. Like, what do we do to beat him? Like, okay, we don't need any shops cards. Like, no, you're probably going to play someone who has shops in their range. So, it's not as easy to overextend, and Luis has used that to his advantage. He was the second seed and made the playoffs, finishing second last year, and he's in second place with a match, edge there this year, and in great position to make another deep run. So, you know, can't knock it.
Now, have we seen the last of Fate Reforged?
Is
Or do you
that
still think Fate Reforged has got something to show us this set?
You mean cards that we haven't seen? Like
Either cards we haven't seen,
monster mentor.
or I don't know. I guess I'm trying to. I'm also curious to your take on Mentor. Although that one's probably a little harder to talk about in anticipation.
I like mentor. I went on record saying I didn't love the shells that it was put in for last trimester, which is not to say that they're not necessarily even right. I mean, it's my personal preference, and um, I really like the card Mana Crypt in conjunction with Monastery Mentor, and I think I would prefer to have less Monastery Mentors. I saw a list that did well last weekend in the big vintage tournament that only played two Monastery Mentors and focused more on Planeswalkers. And if I were to build that deck, that is closer to the direction that I really liked. I saw that list and I thought it looked very strong. Um, very few cards that I wanted to change. There were definitely some sideboard slots that I switch around, especially playing in Vintage Super League. But I really like where that list was. That's closer to the direction that I had been building the deck in. Um, I think Tassiger is a powerful card. I
Yeah,
don't.
Tassiger's the other one that I could definitely see showing up. I mean, I think that if Bomberman was good enough to make the cut, the Bright Bomberman list has a Tassiger in it instead of a Spell Bomb.
Mhm.
I'm not sure if it fits others' shells, but I mean, it's a card that doesn't. It's powerful enough to matter.
Yeah, it certainly has a very powerful effect, and it's very cheap for a rather large creature. But again, you're right. There's not a great home for that, really. I mean, there's a lot of powerful things that you can be doing once you set up a graveyard that do a little bit more than Tastiger, and it is a good finisher in that Bomberman shell, trying to recur infinite mana and make them draw their entire deck when you have every counterspell in the world in your hand. But I'm not sure that that's even a playable strategy. It's hard because you look at Vintage Super League, and some people are going to critique and say that, okay, this is not very representative of Vintage at large. Like, you're missing all these key decks. Look, this deck does well on the East Coast. This deck does well in Europe. And it's like, okay, maybe that's true, and maybe it's not, because AFL Vintage Super League, we have access to all the cards, all of us do, and can play anything we want. And that's not necessarily always true. Their decks are
Mm.
going to be, it's going to be harder for a deck to die out in the live scene because people get invested in their decks. That's just a very real thing. And so
I also
people,
think there's a lot more dredge in the real world than there probably should be because it's the cheapest deck to acquire
yes,
in the,
yeah,
out of real cards.
yeah, and is probably in a lot of ways for people who haven't played Magic for as long, probably a little bit easier to figure out what lines you want to take. Mulligan decisions are of course much easier. The lines of gameplay are pretty intricate, but you can certainly get by with lesser knowledge as opposed to sequencing and then figuring out your fluster storms and your storm counts and going off with Yawgmoth's Will. Like that's a little bit more involved than dredging and making as many guys as you can. Of course, it is very challenging to come up with the exact right sequence you want there, but
Mm-hmm.
the mulligan decisions, especially knowing that you're basically looking for one card as opposed to we've seen a lot of really tough mulligan decisions consistently every week, like hands that some people would snap mulligan and hands that other people snap keep, and everything in between on the opinions on the same hand. So that just shows how involved the decision making is in vintage, and it is really challenging.
All right, so new deck list. Let's take a look at the schedule for this week. Let everybody, if you haven't seen what we're up to, it's week 7 out of 9, right? Round robin schedule. So after 9 weeks, everybody will have played everybody once. Top 4 will go to the playoffs. Last place will not be invited back for season 3. Start off with Bob Maher versus Chris Pakula. Any thoughts about that matchup? I'm just looking forward to watching what these guys show up with mostly, but it's also kind of big in that Chris can actually clinch a postseason berth this way if he gets a little bit of help from Steve Menendian knocking off Rich Shea. Whereas Bob, I think, would like to get a little farther away from last place.
Yeah, I mean, clinching the potential giant tiebreaker cluster that we've talked about last year and can certainly come up again this year is yeah, it's better than not being in that. And of course, Chris is in great shape to not finish last. So at that point, once you've locked up not getting last, you can go for the playoffs, and it's a great place to be. Of course, Bob would like to have less of a sweat going into the last week this year. Last year was definitely an interesting one. He had to win a bunch of matches in a row to end up staying out of
Hey.
this. And so,
Now, if we have a mass tie for the playoffs, by the way, it'll happen at 4 and 5. Like it is still. I know we had this 8-way tie that almost happened last year. There is a very similar scenario with 3 weeks to go right now. It would be an 8-way tie at 4 and 5. So it's sort of getting that fifth win is the big one. The fifth win is. I mean, it's you're probably going to at least tie for the playoffs. Not necessarily. Like I said, if Rich loses, then you can't get enough people ahead of 5 and 4
Okay.
for Chris to win and miss the playoffs, or for me, I'm in the same situation as Chris to win and miss the playoffs.
So we can't have a big tiebreak, a big tie at 5 and 4.
You can. It won't be 8 ways.
Oh no, no, of
So
course
you
not.
can get a tie at 5 and 4, right? So I
Yeah,
say clinch postseason.
yeah.
Clinching postseason is not nearly as exciting as clinching playoffs. I guess that's the distinction I'm making in my head.
Hmm.
Right? You might need a tiebreaker to get through, which obviously you'd love to be above the tiebreaker for. I mean, right now you have clinched the postseason, but hypothetically you could be 6-3, 5. We can get as many as 5 players to 6-3 with the way the standings set right now. But yeah, I mean, like I said, Rich is the bubble guy. If Steve beats Rich, then suddenly you can only get 4 players to 6-3.
Hmm.
And you, Luis, even Chris and I can start to get ourselves in a pretty good shape.
So I believe a lot of people are kind of sweating what Luis plays this trimester. Luis, in his 3 weeks, plays the three people um, in the top half besides himself and you, who is his only loss. So
Wow,
yeah, Luis plays myself. He plays Chris, and then he plays Rich Shea. So he
wow.
is everyone going for the playoff positioning, and Luis has a lot of control on everyone's destiny, I guess.
So I have a lot of control on the other side because
Yeah.
my opponents are Tom Martell, Kai Buddha, and David Williams. So the road to last goes through me. Hopefully, it won't include me. It can only include me in a giant 4-5 breaker.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, no, the bottom three in the standings right now are my last 3 opponents.
Definitely gonna be interesting going into that last week, as is, will
Oh yeah.
generally be the case when we have a 9 round robin. Get a lot of similar records, and even when things started to pull apart last year, we ended up finding ourselves in that nearly 8-way tie. So
Mm-hmm. It
just crazy.
definitely all compressed in the last trimester. I mean, right now the records are fairly far apart. I mean, it seems like it doesn't look like we're headed for mass ties, but they are still live if people start to crunch back toward together again.
Yeah, I mean, any 3-way tie for an important slot is still kind of a massive tie. I mean,
True.
just a 2-way tie is just a big deal. So
Oh
yeah.
yeah. All right. So first match will be Chris versus Bob. Um, yeah, I don't actually want to start the match until the top of the hour, just since people know that Vintage Super League starts at 6 o'clock. So happy to talk about it. But yeah, warn them if yeah, I don't want to start for five. Start the gameplay for 5 minutes. So yeah, Bob versus Chris. Don't know what decks these guys have played. Bob trying to get away from the bottom, Chris trying to stay at the top. But the other match, the big match, we talked this week. We've got you playing LSV is obviously a huge match. Lots of implications in terms of getting those buys in the playoffs, getting the 1 seed locked up.
Mhm.
But the match between Martel and Buddha is a huge match at the bottom of the standings. I don't know. There's just a lot of the scenarios are going to hinge on the way that one plays out. And then I don't know. I like the Vintage World Championship rematch as well with Steve and Rich.
Yeah, that's one of the nice things is that about our quote unquote job or just what we're doing here is that we can build a storyline on any match. That's just what happens when with this
Fair
league.
enough. We do have 10 pretty interesting guys.
Yeah, we got a
All right.
bunch of Hall of Famers, Pro Tour champions, guys with 3, 4, 7 top, so many top eights and so much vintage experience. I mean, it's just like, yeah, you can say any match is kind of fantastic, and it's just true. Like if you just polled the audience, you're going to get people who prefer one match to another one, who their favorite player of all time might be in this match, but it's going to be spread out. Like there's no match of these five where people are just like, that's kind of the one I'm sleeping through. It's like no, like every match is a big match. So yeah, it's pretty fantastic to have these 10 people involved.
Totally agree. Yeah, totally agree. We're getting to the point where we're going to have to figure out who our 10th is. And we haven't actually really talked about that yet.
Yeah, you know, have to
Somebody's going to have
hear
to
what
come.
people want. See, ask the audience.
Oh, the audience has been letting me know. I've definitely had some recommendations on Twitter,
Oh
which
yeah,
is which is which is great. Yeah.
yeah, that's fantastic. So both players here are looking to right the ship. We've had this situation a few times, but Chris started 4-0, lost a couple in a row. Bob went 2-1 with his more homebrew Crucible deck in the first week. Switched to Mentors and just 0-3'd. So yeah, both players trying to get things going right again, so to speak. And it's a big match, you know. Bob does not want to fall into that potential tie for last, or really be sweating it. I guess 2-5 is a lot lower than 3-4. So, and Chris, of course, is trying to hold off Rich, hold off you for you know whatever playoff seeding you might be able to get. And
Hmm.
he was in a similar position last year. He started 3-0 and ended up missing the playoff. So starting 4-0 this year, that I'm sure there's a bit of a sweat going on there. He really wants to get a couple wins and not have to worry about it going into the last week. So definitely a lot on the line to start this thing off.